Hello, this is Brett from Survival Comms, and welcome to How Far Will My Radio Talk? Myths, Marketing, and the Truth. And in this video, we're going to discuss the kind of ranges you can realistically anticipate out of tactical FM equipment, such as a UHF portable radio or a VHF portable radio or their amateur radio counterparts, using field deployable infrastructure and radio-to-radio talk paths. We're not going to discuss propagation that's not day-to-day propagation. We're not going to discuss IP linking and simulcast systems or anything else. This is basically systems that you would establish and control on your very own to communicate with your work group under austere conditions. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to use mathematical models and online tools. You will be able to utilize these models to ascertain what kind of talk paths and range you're actually going to be able to get from your equipment, so that way you can set up your communications plan accordingly. So let's get started. Okay, when we're talking about VHF and UHF communications, 90% of our talk paths are going to be using line of sight propagation, which elevation equals distance in this regard. And what you'll do is if you're standing on top of a building and you look into the distance, and just about anything you can see, you can actually establish a talk path with, as long as you have a clear line of sight. So there's no real mystery to that. So it kind of follows along with the visual horizon theory. And actually, radio horizon is 10 to 15% beyond the visual horizon, depending upon the frequency. Generally, the lower the frequency, the more it goes beyond the visual horizon. So we won't go into that right now. But what we're going to talk about is the formulas for establishing a radio horizon, which is very simple. What you're going to do is you're going to take the height in meters, the square root of such, multiply that times 4.124, and that's going to equal distance 1, and then your receiver or your second transmitter, since this is a two-way talk path, will be the same height in meters, or the square root thereof, times 4.124, and that'll be distance 2. And then what you're going to do is you're going to add those two together, and the sum of which is going to become your radio horizon in kilometers. And you can kind of see an example here that we've put at the bottom. And using two UHF portables, we'll say the people are tall, and their center radiation of their antennas is 2 meters tall, the square root of which is 1.4, multiplied times 4.124 equals 5.77. And we just basically multiply that times 2, or add those two together, and it comes up with a talk path or a radio horizon of 11.55 kilometers. And this is a completely theoretical model. And a lot of times what you'll see is your skin pack radios and these other radios that are 5 to 7 mile range. This is what they're using to base that on for the most part. And if you look at this example here, perfect example of line of sight. That distant shore right there is a little over 3 miles away. And this not only applies to the marine environment, it also applies to the desert or the mountains or any other environment that you find yourself in, to where you actually can see objects in the distance that are not occluded by terrain or man-made objects. Okay, now we're going to talk about how loss factors into our system our theoretical system here that we've set up, and how we can actually measure that loss and how we can compensate for such, and actually try to bring our radio range closer to that theoretical radio horizon. You can see that our system that we've got set up here is we've got transmitter 1 is located 36 meters above sea level, and we have Bobby over here, which is at 2 meters above sea level at transmitter 2. So what you have here is you have your signal path or talk path here, and it's running through clouds representing weather, and trees and buildings and vehicles and high rises, etc., etc. And what we can see is that those represent path loss. Okay, and all loss equals signal attenuation. And you also have system losses to factor in too. In a mobile installation or a portable installation or a repeater or infrastructure installation, you have all kinds of things which can add up to losses in your system. And one thing that's always important to remember is that as your frequency decreases, you lose less in your system and in your path loss. And as your frequency increases, you increase your path loss and your system loss. We're going to talk about loss and how we measure loss, because in order to manage loss, you got to measure it first. Okay, we have system loss and we have path loss. In system loss, we can measure it with coax charts, knowing our antenna and equipment specifications. And we can use it with simple diagnostic tools like a directional watt meter. We can measure your power output of just your transmitter, and then after your feed line and everything going into your antenna, you can go ahead and see how much loss you have in it by comparing your transmitter output directly and then through your feed line and whatever other equipment you have there, and that'll give you an idea. Or what you can do is you can use online tools, which you can get apps or online ERP calculators, and that'll get you in the ballpark on your system losses. Now, path losses, there's two different types. There's a free space path loss, which I'm going to show you the freeze calculator, which is a pretty good one there, but that only measures loss in free space. Remember, there's always loss in free space. And we also have a free space path loss and terrain path loss calculator, which is a link budget calculator, which I'm going to go over real quick. And both of these are tools to give you an estimation of what kind of performance you can expect from your setup. And remember that if you take your transmitter power output, which most of the time I use decibel millivolts, and you subtract your losses or add your gains, and then subtract your path loss, and that's going to give you your link quality or your received signal strength or received power in decibel millivolts. Okay, we're using Pasternak Enterprises online freeze calculator, which you can get at pasternak.com, and you can see that we've got all our variables entered into the boxes here, and you see our result right here. So you can actually enter this in watts if you don't want to go to the bother of converting it to decibel millivolts, and you can see all your values right there. Now let's go ahead and see how this affects us in the real world, and what kind of signal minus 65.23 decibel millivolts is. Okay, our test receiver we're going to use is just a old school Yaesu FT50. We've got it set for receive at 460 megahertz, and we're going to go ahead and use my service monitor as a signal source, and we're going to go ahead and hit it right now with minus 65.23 decibel millivolts of signal. You can see that's a good signal. You can see we're full scale. So theoretically, even with free space loss, we've still got a full quieting signal at 11 kilometers. Okay, now we're going to talk about use of a link budget calculator. The one I use is from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's in a spreadsheet format, so you can use it offline. And you can download it and just type in NIST link budget calculator spreadsheet, and you'll find it in the search engine. And it takes so many variables into account, and this is where you start to see the 5 to 7 mile range of your skin pack radios fall apart, because it takes terrain and free space path loss into account. It's set up with different models for large urban, small urban, suburban, and open terrain. So in the same spreadsheet, you can just change those variables and see what your different results are. Since it does use a HADA model, it's kind of limited in frequencies below 150 megahertz and above 1500. What you'll do is you start putting in like low band numbers and HF numbers. You come up with all these interesting receive signal numbers that are not correct, and that's just basically because of the limitation of the formulas they're using. But again, we're using 5-watt portable radios 11 kilometers away from each other, with the center of radiation of both antennas is 2 meters above ground. Small city and unity gain antennas, and I've went ahead and run the 500 milliwatts is 147.4 decibel millivolts. 5 watts is minus 137.3 decibel millivolts, and 50 and 110 watts represent mobile radios, because 2 meters is accurate for a unity gain antenna mounted on a vehicle. And you can see that minus 127.4 at 50 watts and minus 123.9 at 110 watts. Okay, you can see this is a spreadsheet. It's version 124 of Link Calc. And you can see when you go to Link Powers, you enter your transmit power here. And you can go ahead and do it watts, milliwatts, or decibel millivolts. And this is all stuff for noise, temperature, and everything. This actually will determine link reliability. And a lot of the stuff right here, we're not really concerned with a lot of that right now. And then you have your gains right here, which in unity gain antennas, I've entered in 2.2 right here. And then your losses, when you get to this here, you can see you can enter transmission line losses, which you'll find when you do your system losses. And then you look right here that we've got our antenna height, center frequency, and environment right here. And then you come up with your summary, and it gives us our transmit power, our gains, with our antenna gains, and then our losses, path loss, which is 178.6 decibels. And it gives us our sum, which is minus 137.4. Now these other ones here, unless you know all these other variables here, on your noise, temperature, and your receiver settings and stuff like that, these right here aren't very accurate. You would end up, if you knew those numbers, then you could certainly go ahead and enter them in there. And it shows you your effective link reliability here is 0%. And it also shows you your distance for desired reliability is 2.307 kilometers. So that brings us into reality of what the range of a portable radio to portable radio truly is. Now let's see what these signals will sound like on our test receiver. Okay, for our test receiver here, you can see I had to open the squelch up here, and we have no signal, and this is at the 5-watt level right here. Now when we bring the numbers down here, right now we are at our 50-watt radio. So 2 50-watt radios over 11 kilometers with their center of radiation, their antennas at 2 meters high. That's the kind of signal strength you could expect. And with 110-watt radios, you're right there. So you can see the difference in received signal strength there. Okay, using what we know already and using the link budget calculator and modeling it with a sample receiver, what we can see is we can come to some conclusions using these models. And the question is, how far will my radio talk? And the answer is, it depends. as vague as that sounds. Elevation and clear line of sight is always going to give you a greater amount of distance. And with our test receiver, our perceptible receiver threshold is minus 127 decibel millivolts, which is actually, that's not usable. That's just where you could just hear the 1 kilohertz tone. 1 S unit on the test receiver was minus 118 decibel millivolts. Full quieting is minus 94, and 50% on the signal strength meter is minus 101. So if we use the 1S unit as a rule, we use that and say it's minus 118, we can look at our little chart I've made up here, where what we have is a transmitter at a frequency of 460 megahertz at various heights, and the receiver's the handheld radio at ground level in suburban terrain using the link budget calculator over a distance of 11 kilometers. You can see that the advantage in elevation is tremendous and is much greater than just power output alone. So you can see that just getting 10 meters puts everything over the top and puts everything into a relatively useful range. Now, mind you, we weren't using any kind of building attenuation factors or anything like that. The suburban model is actually very reliable for outdoor terrain compared to using the open model. The open model is it's a little more conservative than a free space path loss formula, but it still is very liberal compared to, actual losses. Okay, now we're going to talk about my rough rule. This is basically what I tell my people and what I've discovered after doing this for the past quarter century, and in very austere conditions. Always used unity gain or less than 3 dB antennas, and all of this equipment is equipment that you can put on your back and carry to a different location like that. This is stuff that's realistic, and it's stuff that's flexible enough to be deployed quickly and easily by a minimum amount of manpower. So as you can see here, we've got our coverage contours, that circle right there. We've got transmitter 1 in the center and transmitter 2. Okay, portable to portable coverage for that is 1 mile between transmitter 1 and transmitter 2. That's in suburban terrain and wooded terrain, and in urban terrain it's a little bit less depending upon the structural density of the materials involved. Mobile to mobile, 3 miles. That's 2 vehicles running 20-watt radios, driving up and down the highway or whatever. You'll usually get about 3 miles of range. Sometimes you can get a little bit more. Field deployable repeater, 5 miles, and that's 15 watts at 10 meters above your transmitting and receiving stations. That gives you a pretty good coverage contour. 6 to 10 mile coverage contour is realistic to portable radios. To mobile radios, you'll certainly be able to get a 10-mile coverage contour with a field deployable repeater. Remember to take every advantage of elevation you can. Elevation is key to distance. If you can take advantage of existing structures, vegetation, street signs, whatever have you, to go ahead and facilitate expanding your communications coverage, do so. And don't ever overestimate your coverage contours in planning. Whenever you're going into an area or you're sending people out into an area that's outside of your planned coverage contour, always take that into consideration and consider using some kind of adjunct to cover them in that area rather than trying to play catch up in that regard. Selection of equipment. UHF works better in urban terrain in cities than VHF does, and VHF works better in the rural environment than UHF does. Your mileage may vary. And train with your assets. You have to know your equipment in order to use it properly. So take your stuff out there, play with it, figure it out, form your communications plan, and roll with it. I hope this helps. This is Brett from Survival Comms. Till next time.